What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are picking up with Infinity Wars Prime #1. Now, I thought about doing Countdown to Infinity Wars, but it's totally unnecessary. It's basically a Guardians of the Galaxy story, and the Guardians fight the Gardeners. It's not even that interesting of a story. The big takeaway from that, well, there were like two big takeaways. One is that Galactus goes back to being the Devourer of Worlds, and Silver Surfer goes back to being his Herald. And the other one is that there is a character called Requiem, which we'll talk about her here in a minute, because I have a pretty solid theory on who that character is. But nonetheless, initially this picks up with Loki, right? This is the actual Infinity Wars story itself. And this is basically the whole event of like a race for the Infinity Stones. And different people are chasing after the Infinity Stones for different reasons. For example, Gamora is hunting the Soul Stone because she learned there was a fraction of her soul that was still stuck in it. Now, in reality, that's Jerry Dugan and Marvel kind of hitting back to the old Jim Starlin stories, right? Like you go read the old Jim Starlin comics from, back in the 80s and 90s, and Gamora, alongside Pip the Troll and Adam Warlock, had spent a brunt of their time inside of Soul World. The issue with this was that it was always believed that when Gamora came back, that it was her whole and complete self. What we ended up learning is that a part of herself was still stuck there, and it actually aged, which didn't really make any sense because in the Soul Stone, nobody ever ages. So it's kind of interesting, but there was basically an old version of herself that was there, and it was the hunt to find that complete part of herself and to bring it back. And so the result here is that initially we basically end up joining with Loki. Now, Loki's an omnipotent city, and for those of you guys who have been following the Thor comics for a little while, this originally made its debut back in 2013 with Thor God of Thunder #3, I'm pretty sure. But basically, Omnipotent City was this place that was designed by writer Jason Aaron to essentially kind of flesh out the Thor mythos and build on it, right? There was essentially like this big parliamentary location where originally it was built by the Elder Gods before they died off or, were, essentially removed from the landscape, and that ultimately it's kind of served as like a house of sorts. What this also does is this introduces a guy by the name of Floa, which basically he's a tomb keeper. A tome keeper. Now, the tome keepers are actually kind of a new concept in Marvel. And the reason why is because, again, Jason Aaron was building on a lot of things. So it makes sense when you're talking about the Asgardian mythos, because it's such a huge portion of Marvel Comics right now, because you have the War of Realms, and there are a lot of changes that were made, you can't really ignore them, especially when you consider the fact that Jason Aaron's run is like this multifaceted run that's been going on for quite some time. And so a lot of the things that are going on with Asgard either tie into the existing Asgardian mythos or act as a complement to it. Of course, we had like the Congress of Worlds, for example, and you had like this sort of multiversal library of all these old books and different things like that. But the tome keepers are guys who basically keep all these different tomes, these sort of history books and different things like that, these books in a wide array of different things. Now, the idea behind this was that originally they were all confined to a singular location, but Freya, the wife of Odin, had essentially made the decision to basically go through and to start splitting them off into different locations. And this actually served the purpose of being beneficial when Asgard was essentially destroyed. And so because Asgard's gone, because now all you have is Asgardia, the version of Asgard that Iron Man built after the events of Siege, what you have now is essentially like all these different locations around in this sort of Asgardian realm that house all these different books on history and artifacts and things like that. And what Loki's been doing is, if anything, from what I can tell, is actually pouring over what amounts to what-if stories. Basically stories that take place in alternate universes. And the reason why is he starts talking about how like all these stories have Marvel characters in them, but events basically unfold in different ways. So like Spider-Man never loses the Venom symbiote, Captain America never, he's never frozen in ice and he basically becomes president of the United States, different things like that. But Loki is essentially pouring over all these books because in none of these does he ever actually take over and become ruler of Asgard. Loki's always the backup guy. He's always kind of the guy that never really leads into a singular place. And so the question becomes, what's going on with all this? Like, information in your books are incomplete or they're incorrect, and we have to go find factual information. Well, of course, at this point, Thor basically says, look, you have to go to the God Quarry if you want to figure that out. Now, of course, for those of you guys who have been reading Thanos, the God Quarry was invented in that line of comics. And it's basically this idea that there is a place out there on the edge of the universe, on the edge of like the dimensional space, that if you can go into the God Quarry, survive the test of the three witches, which is to basically not give in to the illusion that you see, then you'll emerge with a whole, with a heightened level of power. Now, the idea is that it's an enhancement of power. What Dugan seems to be hitting here is basically saying it's not just power, it's also knowledge. And so it's the idea that Loki can enter into the God Quarry and then in turn start looking at all this information that's there and get an actual account of the various universes that exist out there. Now again, there's different ways that this can go. We know that Infinity Wars is basically going to come down to the various possessors of the Soul Stones facing off against one another, and likely it may or may not turn into kind of like a reboot of sorts for Marvel. It'll likely be a soft reboot, but it'll probably be like a reboot of sorts, where they'll use the Reality Stone to go through and start fixing things, making small adjustments, different things like that. How that will impact things, we don't know, but it could be that other characters from different universes get pulled in because of Loki's knowledge with the God Quarry. He goes to those different universes, grabs them, and brings them over. One of the cool things is that there's going to be the Infinity Warp, which is actually based off the Jasper's Warp, and it's essentially like the merging of characters. There's a lot of really cool things that are going to come out of Infinity Wars this summer. It seems like it'll be one of the better events that Marvel's done in the last decade, which in truth kind of makes sense, with the exception of Secret Wars, Secret Empire, Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, taking those into account. There's only, there are like only a handful of events that have been great. Everything else has just kind of been there. It's just stuff that's happened. I still say to this day, Secret Empire is one of the best Captain America stories ever written. I know people get angry at me for saying that because I'm not agreeing with them, but still, like, I thought it was an amazing story. I thought it was absolutely awesome. But of course, this basically leads to Throa basically grabbing Loki, and the two of them sort of go on a journey to the God Quarry, which is kind of a cool idea. But at this point, we switch over to Adam Warlock and Doctor Strange. Now remember, when it comes to the Soul Stone in Marvel Comics, Adam Warlock is part and parcel to it. I mean, it's as much a part of him as like an arm or a leg or anything like that, because he spent so much time inside of it and so much time wielding it. I mean, again, that goes back to the old Jim Starlin stories. This idea that Adam Warlock was given the Soul Stone by the High Evolutionary, and he used his power to achieve various feats, but found out in the future he would be driven insane by it, which would lead to the formation of the Magus. And while this goes into the full publication history of Adam and the various stories and events that have taken place, over the years, he's really found himself, instead of entering into a cocoon of sorts to basically regenerate, instead he would go into the Soul Stone, and that would be his sort of place of solace, his kind of Zen location, more or less. And so because of the fact that he's so part and parcel to it, he can sort of enter and leave as he pleases. But the idea is that people are gathering the Soul Stones, gathering the Infinity Stones, and that's why everybody's chasing after them. Now, for Doctor Strange himself, the belief of Adam was that all the Soul Stones except for the all the Infinity Stones except for the Soul Stone had been destroyed following the collapse of the multiverse and its rebirth. But Doctor Strange basically reveals that he has the Soul Stone. Now, this comes out of Infinity War's countdown. Basically, it was the revelation that the Skrulls had gotten their hands on the Time Stone during the events of that whole thing and like Planet Hulk 2 and so on and so forth. But this basically leads to the idea that Stephen Strange has it in his possession and doesn't tell anybody about it. And in reality, this is Dugan and company kind of hitting home at like the Illuminati, like Brian Michael Bendis' Illuminati, which is to say this group of people who took the Soul Stones under themselves, the Infinity Stones, under themselves, and said no one else is going to be able to use these things. We're the only people who are quote unquote capable of wielding them without being corrupted by them. With this whole thing in mind, what ends up happening is the idea is to go into the Soul Stone and to see what effect the Soul Stone's having, to basically, kind of see how everything's going down. And when Adam enters it, we end up finding the Soul Stone is literally being corrupted. Adam Warlock's powers don't work here. And so this is really kind of Jerry Dugan hitting on the idea that things are unfolding at a pretty rapid pace. There's a lot of ambiguity here. There's a lot of questions that are being asked and a lot of questions that will be answered over time. And where Doctor Strange is on the outside, basically has a tether attached to Adam to pull him back out in case of an emergency, it doesn't seem to work. And so when Doctor Strange enters back in, he ends up finding Adam Warlock is like totally impaled. And so it's one of those crazy things, because what ends up happening here is he manipulates the Time Stone to basically pull Adam Warlock back out, at least to try to save his life. And of course, this leads to Adam Warlock basically saying, hey, look, you've had the Time Stone the entire time. Why didn't you tell me? Now, this is not the first time Doctor Strange has done this, right? Like to use the Time Stone in such a fashion. By and large, the manipulation of time in Marvel Comics is something that you don't usually like to see people, or that people like Doctor Strange don't usually like to use. And the reason why goes back for a variety of reasons. I mean, one of the more tangible reasons came out of the events of Age of Ultron, right? When you had Wolverine who was jumping back and forth through time, and it was sort of this revelation that time itself is a physical thing, that it's like a rubber band. If you pull on it and you allow it to contract enough times, eventually you'll basically destroy its elasticity and it'll snap. And that's really what happened with like Age of Ultron, basically that time was quote unquote broken. But when you look at things like this, the idea of Doctor Strange is to say the entire multiverse exists as branch universe theory, that if you go back in time and you change something, you'll create a wholly new different universe. It won't necessarily affect the current time stream, but you don't know what kind of universe you'll create, what kind of beings you'll lead to. Because in Marvel Comics, you're talking about a wide array of different characters, some of whom are multiversal. And so what you could end up doing here is inadvertently creating a universe where like Jean Grey never loses the Phoenix Force, goes insane by its power, and decides to wipe out the entire multiverse in the process. You could go through and like inadvertently resurrect the Beyonders, and suddenly they're dealing with time runs out all over again. There's all kinds of different things that could come with the manipulation of time. And so Doctor Strange sort of keeping it under wraps, saying, look, no one's supposed to know about this, is a pretty big deal. The other half of this is that Adam Warlock says, look, you can keep the time stone in your possession, just know that there are people out there who are looking for it. And you know that one individual in particular will come searching for the Infinity Stones. It's the nature of who he is. As soon as the multiverse was recreated, as soon as this universe was restored by Reed Richards and the Fantastic Four, that with the restoration of the Infinity Stones, he would come looking for them. This person, of course, being Thanos. And so it's kind of a cool thing because what this does is seem to play on the idea that Thanos is going to basically try to start capturing the Infinity Stones again. And at the outset, it's a little bit like, really? Like Thanos with the Infinity Stones again? It's happened a million times. And that's the perception that's put off here, because it's like this grandiose speech. You know, I lead the army of the Chitauri. The universe is full of weaklings. You know, I will seize the Infinity Stones just like I always do, and I will take absolute power once again. The problem is that while he's making this speech, he's completely impaled by somebody with a sword. And this is when we get our full-on view of Requiem. And it's cool. Like, Requiem looks pretty awesome. Now, one of the small things that have been happening here as part of Infinity War's countdown, and there were like one-page things at the beginning of every story, is that this character Requiem had basically gone to a dwarf and said, fashion me this particular type of sword and don me this type of armor. And if you don't, I'll kill you. And that was basically it. And that's what led to Requiem appearing the way it is. But Requiem goes through and literally just like annihilates Thanos. Now, the funny thing, and here's an important thing to bear in mind, Thanos recognizes Requiem. It's just kind of like, okay, I was wondering how long it would be before you got here. Now, this has led into a litany of theories. Some people have said that Requiem is like Gamora. Other people speculate that Requiem is Nebula, that is basically like a repeat of Infinity Gauntlet. A lot of people are speculating all these different things. If I were a betting man, I'd bet all the money in my pockets to all the money in your pockets that Requiem is actually Phyla-Vell. And the reason why I say this is because for those of you guys who don't know, and I imagine there's a lot of people who don't know, Phyla-Vell is the biological daughter of the original Captain Marvel, who of course was one of the members of the Kree. Now, of course, the original Captain Marvel died in 1984, but while different characters went on to take over the mantle, Phyla-Vell was one of the most notable versions. She eventually went on to become the newest version of Quasar. But when it comes to Phyla-Vell's character, she was awesome. I mean, she was badass. There was a point where she became a bit of a villain, but the whole reason why I say I think it's her is because 1, Thanos recognizes her. 2, she kills Thanos. Now, this is kind of a mirror reflection of what we saw in Realm of Kings when Thanos emerges from a cocoon, having been resurrected, and immediately kills Phyla-Vell. So like, I would say that's probably her. But still, following this, like, it's basically a crusade to take out Thanos and everything Thanos stands for. Because where the laws of combat in the Chitauri society basically say you keep what you kill, something akin to like the Chronicles of Riddick, what this means is that she's now the leader of the Chitauri army. And in response, she kills them all. Like, she annihilates them all in their entirety. And she basically says, this is it. This is what's going to happen here. You know, I'm essentially taking over the entirety of this whole thing. I've wiped out Thanos. Thanos is gone, and we have no real idea what her motivations are. But again, I think the idea of it being Phyla-Vell is awesome, because if she's the daughter of the original Captain Marvel, then what that'll do is it'll bring her and Carol Danvers into direct conflict. And basically she could show up and say, you don't need to be here. And I think it would lead to an awesome fight between the two. And so it's just kind of like man, like this, it's an awesome concept. You could do so many cool things out of this. It could very well just turn out that it's Nebula and that's it. But I think it'd be a little disappointing if it turned out to be Nebula, because it's too predictable of an idea. Ultimately, the story's supposed to end in October. And so in reality, you'll find out who it is. If it is Nebula, you'll find that out depending on what happens in like Avengers 4, like how the trailer unfolds with Avengers 4, because Marvel Comics is kind of copying the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so like that'll basically give away the ending, how this whole thing ends with regards to like Avengers 4. You know, that'll really kind of seal the deal here. But it's a cool concept and it's a cool idea. I'm really hoping that it's not a brand new character, because what Marvel has a tendency to do is to create a brand new character and a writer does something awesome with them. You know, like Adam Brashear by Kevin Graveau. And then like it's this amazing introductory story, and then no one ever knows what to do with them. So they basically just get shuffled off to the cornfields and you never really hear from them again. Whereas if this is a character that's long since lost, then you can basically throw them back into the shuffle in the same role they've always been in, or create a new one for them, and then like everything becomes awesome after that. So I'm pretty excited. Like I'm pretty hyped to see how all this is going to unfold. Okay, so my girlfriend says I always open my videos that way, and I never really noticed it before, but apparently I do. now that I think about it. It's like learning about my speech cadence, that like apparently I talk a certain way, and like my voice goes up and then it goes down. And I never noticed that before. Apparently that pattern is what makes my voice soothing. I have no idea. We are covering Infinity Wars. All right, so Infinity Wars basically deals with this kind of mad dash for like the Infinity Stones, right? And at the outset, and we saw this in Infinity Wars Prime, at the outset, it was like, okay, Thanos is hunting the Infinity Stones again, which is kind of par for the course. Like the Infinity Stones are almost part and parcel to Thanos' character. But in that story at the end, someone named Requiem killed Thanos, and then it was kind of like, okay, that's insane. And so right now, what we're doing is we're kind of picking up in the aftermath of that, and really the recognition from the various superheroes on Earth that someone's hunting the Infinity Stones. Now, what we do here is we pick up initially with Gamora. Now, Gamora is meeting with Peter Quill, and it's kind of a cool moment because what she says is that a piece of her is missing. And to talk about this for a second, I want to discuss the concept of Soul World inside the Soul Stone. So when it comes to Marvel Comics, back when, really Jim Starlin was writing the old Adam Warlock and the old Thanos stories and so on and so forth, Soul World was introduced in such a way to where it was a universal world across the board, which is to say it's a world inside the Soul Stone and it looks the same to everybody in it. There is no differentiation there. What Marvel's done recently is they've basically taken the Marvel Cinematic Universe version of Soul World and they've thrown it into the comics, which seems to indicate the idea that the structure and the form of Soul World is relative to each individual soul that's in it, right? It's like the afterlife, essentially, from like the old X-Men comics from Chris Claremont, when Jean Grey as the White Phoenix meets with Death, and Death basically says, we have all these pillars here, and each one of these pillars is the afterlife for each individual person. Changing it now, Gamora, we know that part of her is still stuck in there. Now, the indication here is that she's always been there, that where she and Adam Warlock and Pip the Troll had basically sacrificed their lives back in the later days of the Thanos War, back when Jim Starlin was writing it, that where Adam Warlock had left completely and so did Pip the Troll, a portion of Gamora stayed behind. Now again, as we know, that's Marvel's way of kind of working in the end of Infinity War into the comic book landscape and then telling a story based off of that. But the fact remains here that Gamora's trying to find a way to basically get that piece of her soul back. That's really what all this has been. And so she's essentially the first of many people who seem to be going after the Infinity Stones for their own individual reasons. And what she ends up doing is actually, taking the Power Stone along with her. Now, one of the other things to bear in mind here is that, of course, Peter Quill has a Power Stone as the aftermath to essentially the entire lead up countdown to Infinity Wars. And so if you want to check that out, you can check out Countdown, but all Countdown is really just a series of Guardians of the Galaxy stories, and they're not super important. I mean, they're cool, but they're by no means required reading. But suffice it to say, the Guardians of the Galaxy are basically disbanded at this point. The team doesn't really exist anymore. And so with Gamora leaving, what we end up doing is picking up with Groot. Now, for those of you guys who are not current, the fact that Groot is speaking full sentences will strike you as weird. Like, you'll just kind of be like, what? Groot can now speak. Yes, that was part of the countdown to Infinity Wars, but it was a battle with the Gardener. And essentially the Gardener was, of course, one of the elders of the universe. And what ended up happening is that where the Flora Colossi were basically defeated and so on, that Groot was adjusted so that he was no longer relegated to saying his own name, that he could basically speak full sentences, but he's required to say it in the third person, which is why he'll say, Groot told you Gamora would not join us, And so what we do from here is we pick up with the actual superheroes of Earth proper, which is to say Adam Warlock and Drax the Destroyer and so on. And they're basically meeting up with like all these villains, which is kind of a weird scenario. It's not something you normally see. Now, these are by no means like high profile villains, right? Like you've got Turk, you've got Bullseye, you've got Sandman, but you've got what basically are street level villains. And it's kind of a smart move. And the reason for this is because what Doctor Strange is doing is he's calling together the second iteration of the Infinity Watch, which is what Star-Lord, what Peter Quill is essentially showing up to join. Now, for those of you guys who are new to Marvel Comics, the Infinity Watch is most likely it'll be the litmus test for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Most likely, I would wager that those individuals who decide whose contracts are up and who don't want to come back or who want to take a break, they'll become part of the Infinity Watch and they'll be shuffled off into the universe somewhere, and you'll probably never see them except for like 1 or 2 times. But the Infinity Watch was a team that was created by Jim Starlin in the aftermath of Infinity Gauntlet, and then in turn became like an actually pretty long-running team for a while. You had like Moondragon, you had Pip the Troll, you had Drax the Destroyer, you had Thanos, you had Adam Warlock, and I want to say you had Gamora. But basically what had happened here was that at the end of Infinity Gauntlet, because Thanos had gone crazy, because Adam Warlock was deemed not worthy of wielding the Infinity Gauntlet proper, in turn, the Living Tribunal decreed that the gems would never work in unison again, and that Adam Warlock had to disperse them so that the gems could still be used, but they couldn't form the gauntlet. So the Mind Stone still worked, the Time Stone, Space Stone, Reality Stone, so on and so forth. They all still worked independently, but in order to make sure that no one would try to, gather them together again, or to make sure that nobody would ever, get each individual stone and use it for their own ends, Adam Warlock formed the Infinity Watch, and they were designed for the purpose of just safeguarding the Infinity Stones. That's all they really did. Doctor Strange calling this together is done for the purpose of finding a way to secure the stones. And his idea here is that the stones have to be removed from the face of the earth. They have to be taken away here, because if they remain here, they're in a centralized location and they're easy to access. Now, Doctor Strange adopting this idea actually comes out of his experience with the Illuminati. That was the problem. When all these guys came together and formed the Illuminati, they, one of the first things they did was, seek out the Infinity Stones and then keep them in unison, keep them together, and then in turn disperse each of them to a member of the Illuminati for safekeeping. But they were all held on Earth. And so if anybody decided to show up on Earth and then take the stones, it would be much, much easier as opposed to if they were scattered all across the universe. And so that's the response of Doctor Strange here. We have to find a way to, one, keep these things safe and move them all over the place, to basically scatter them all across the cosmos so they won't be easily accessible. Now, of course, for some of the guys who are here, the kind of question is, what even is all this? Because remember, for a lot of street level characters, they don't really know what Infinity Stones are. But then you have someone like Turk Barrett, who basically uses the Mind Stone. He's kind of a street level guy. He was originally a henchman for Kingpin, and then he in turn got a hold of the Mind Stone and then started listening to the minds of like stockbrokers and people like that, and basically started jumping into insider trading. And so by listening to, using the Mind Stone to realize what was going on behind the scenes, what people were thinking about various stocks and so on, he would shift his investments accordingly and then made himself super rich, which is actually a pretty smart way, because how else are they going to trace it to insider trading? I mean, there's no conceivable way to. And so from there, like, it's people just kind of asking questions. Now, the other part of this is that Adam Warlock even chimes in and says there's something going on with the Soul Stone. It's corrupted in some way. Now, for people who've been reading Marvel Comics for a long time, the fact that Adam Warlock is not the one leading the charge is a very big deal. And again, this is just reminiscent of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's one of those things where Marvel is bringing the comics closer in line with the movies. Because if the Marvel Cinematic Universe didn't exist and this story was published, Adam Warlock would most likely be the one assembling the Infinity Watch. But the entire success or failure of the defeat of Thanos in Infinity War in Avengers 4 rests on the shoulders of the plan of Doctor Strange. And so it makes sense that Doctor Strange in the comics would be the one running the show, because Marvel's trying to make sure they're kind of brought closer in line here. Now, it's kind of crazy because remember, when it comes to the Infinity Stones, you don't have to use them all in unison. You can use a couple of them together. And that's what Doctor Strange does. Doctor Strange actually uses the Time Stone alongside the Reality Stone and peers and essentially grants himself cosmic awareness momentarily, only to discover that Thanos has been killed. And that's the whole basis behind this, because if Thanos is hunting for the Infinity Stones, which is what all the rumors had been indicating, then it made sense to form the Infinity Watch. But if Thanos has been killed, then the question becomes, who in the hell killed him? And so from there, what we end up doing is picking up with Loki. What Loki's doing here is traveling to the God Quarry. And the reason why is because even Loki himself has questions about what's going on with the bigger picture and different things like that. And it's going to be kind of interesting here, because what Jerry Dugan's going to do is he's going to tease something pretty important. What ends up happening is when Loki gets to the God Quarry, he ends up running into the Coven, the three witches. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, the inclusion of the God Quarry here is a little intriguing, because when Jeff Lemire introduced the God Quarry in the Thanos line of stories, the concept seemed to be that those who enter the God Quarry, I mean, it's kind of a place where old gods go to die. So it's kind of like the bar of the fulcrum for the Celestials. It's like where they go to die and then pass on to wherever Celestials go when they die. But for this, it's basically various gods. But a person can go to the God Quarry and they can submit themselves to the test of the quarry. And what it'll do is it'll basically put them through a psychological and physical test, kind of, bending reality and giving them like the one universe they always wanted to exist. And if they pass the test, then they're given the power of the God Quarry. If they fail, they're locked there forever. But the fact remains that when Loki gets here and he starts talking to the Coven's initial response is like, everything is at an end, like eternity is ending. And then in response, the God Quarry seems to be destroyed and the Coven is basically gone. That seems to be what's going on there, because what ends up happening is you end up having this version of Loki who crash lands into the main Marvel universe. He's got a hammer, he's got Thor's hammer, and he has the Infinity Stones, which is kind of crazy here. But this is an alternate reality version of himself. But this is exceedingly important. This is probably one of the most important things that we're going to have here, because what happens is when the main Marvel universe Loki starts talking to this, Uber version of himself, God Loki, or whatever you want to call him, Infinity Loki, I think is a cool name. What you have is the Infinity Loki referring to something called the original universe. And this is kind of crazy here because Marvel hasn't done this yet. Now, this is kind of a cool moment because what this seems to indicate is maybe the role of the Infinity Stones has shifted. And what I mean by that is in Marvel Comics, the Infinity Stones are only relative to the universe they're in, right? Like you can't take the Infinity Stones from, the main Marvel universe and then show up in the real world and use them, or like show up in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and use them, right? It doesn't work that way. Thanos can't leave the Marvel Cinematic Universe with the Infinity Stones, take them to the main Marvel universe, and wreak havoc, right? The power of the Infinity Stones can only be used in that particular universe. And we know that from a variety of different stories. And so what goes on here is it seems like the Infinity Stones are almost like an ability to gain passage from one universe to the next. That kind of seems to be the case. And that would make sense, because if what this guy is saying is true, and if what Jerry Dugan is hitting on is true, then it would seem like all existing Infinity Stones all across the cosmos all originate with the original universe. And if that's true, it would almost be like creating a bridge to access that original universe. Because notice, the way that Jerry Dugan writes this version of Loki doesn't say you can't access all the other universes without your Infinity Stones. It's simply the statement, you can't access the original universe. So it makes sense. And so what ends up happening is this version of Loki goes back to his own universe, kind of teleports back to the battle that he's fighting at, which involves like all these superheroes, right? Like the Avengers and like the Asgardians and so on and so forth. And like they're all killed by a Soul Eater. Like they're all basically wiped out completely. It's kind of crazy, because switching back to Doctor Strange and switching back to the various members of the Infinity Watch as they're formed, what we end up doing is the whole group is met by the arrival of like Thor and Iron Man. And it's kind of the question of what in the hell is going on here right now? Like, what is this? And so where you have like the villains who kind of break into a fight against the heroes and nobody really trusts anybody and so on and so forth, then they're met with the arrival of Requiem, the person that killed Thanos. And all eyes turn to whoever in the heck this character is. And it's kind of nuts, because from here, like Requiem basically has the Power Stone in their sword. And so that's where the question kind of has to be asked. If Gamora took the Power Stone, then did Requiem kill Gamora and take it? And it's kind of cool, because if that's the case, then Requiem is insanely dangerous, because Gamora was one of the most powerful fighters in the Marvel universe. And so people begin asking the question, who in the heck are you? And of course, Requiem responds by saying, Thanos referred to me as his Requiem, and so that's what I am. Like I am Requiem. And the various characters start to go on the offensive, right? Like Groot's the first one to attack, Groot's the first one taken down. Peter Quill uses his freeze gun. Like all these people start firing on Requiem. Then Rocket Raccoon comes out of nowhere and blows Requiem's helmet off, only for us to find out that it's been Gamora the whole time. And it's just kind of like, damn, because like Gamora killed Thanos. And it makes sense, right? Like it makes perfect sense that Gamora would be the one to do it. I mean, again, Marvel's rolling the Marvel Cinematic Universe over into the comics slowly and slowly, bit by bit. And so of course, given what's happened in the MCU, it makes sense that Gamora would be intertwined and she'd be the one to take down Thanos, which I don't know if that'll happen in Avengers 4, but if I were a betting man, I'd say Gamora will be the one to kill Thanos. But even then, as long of a history as she's had in Marvel Comics, and as long as she's been an enemy of Thanos in Marvel Comics, it makes sense that she would be the one to kill him, either her or Nebula. Like Nebula might be the one to take Thanos down. But at the end of the day, it ends up being like Gamora who is the one who kills him. And what she ends up saying is like, I did this because I'm on a quest for the Soul Stone. Like I'm on a quest for the Infinity Stones and the Soul Stones themselves. And so if you can't do this, if you can't help me out, if you're going to get in my way, then I'll take all of you out. Like that's just the way it is. Like I will take out every single one of you. Like I'll destroy you all. And Gamora will. Peter Quill goes to call her bluff, right? Like Peter Quill's like, well, no, you're not. Like I've fought with you forever. Like I fought with you for a long time. We've been Guardians of the Galaxy. We've been lovers together. Like I know you're not going to kill me. And her response is, yes, I will, Peter. And she plunges her sword right through his chest and impales him. And it's just like, wow, Gamora just killed Star-Lord. It's pretty crazy. Okay, so we're getting into Infinity Wars, really Infinity Wars Part 2. This is basically coming off the heels of like Gamora capturing the Infinity Stones, which is kind of weird. The idea that Gamora was basically a character called Requiem who killed Thanos. Honestly, I felt like it was way too early for a reveal. I'm not really sure why Jerry Dugan decided to drop the reveal so fast, but I don't know, maybe there's other crazy stuff in store. The only thing I can surmise here is that Avengers 4 is going to end with Gamora taking out Thanos, and so it was more like an editorial mandate, because we know like Marvel's kind of adjusting the comics to copy the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so it's kind of interesting. But the fact remains here that what this does is kind of pick up with the past a little bit. And it really kind of gives us like this continual journey with regards to Gamora's character. Remember, she's part of a race called the Zinroberis, and her people were wiped out by another group. I think it was the, oh God, what was it? It starts with a B, the Badoon? I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, it's when she was an adult, she went back and wiped out the people who wiped out her people. So when she was younger, of course, Thanos taking her under his wing really taught her to be pretty hardcore. I mean, basically helped to turn her into like one of the universe's most, prodigious assassins, really the most dangerous woman in the universe. But one of the things that Thanos talks about here, and this is kind of interesting, one of the things he talks about here is the idea that basically everything ends, that everything will die at some point or another. And he really follows this ideology that like only the strongest lives survive. Now this is kind of uncharacteristic of Thanos' character. And the reason why I say that is right now in Marvel Comics in the present day, Thanos has kind of abandoned the idea of Mistress Death, right? He walked away from that and said she's basically a lost cause and said he didn't want to have anything to do with it. But then like like when you go back and you look at Thanos in the past, he was very much enamored with Mistress Death. And so it wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense for him to adopt this mentality that like only the strong deserve to survive, because the governing factor of Thanos and everything he did was attaining the affections of Mistress Death. And so it would make more sense here if he said, well, I killed him to please Mistress Death, because Death likes, the sacrifice of life, or life is meaningless because of course he's a nihilist or something along those lines. But he doesn't really say that. He just kind of hints to like kind of an extreme social Darwinist perspective that only the strong deserve to survive. And it's kind of a funny thing because Gamora responds by saying, well, if that's true, then the time will come when you will die. You told me as much, but like somebody will kill you. And Thanos recognizes it and says, yes, that's the nature of things. The universe is grooming someone to take me out. So again, it's not really characteristic of Thanos for us to hear him talk that way. And that's why it's so intriguing, because there's obviously a lot of influence here coming from the Marvel Cinematic Universe is being copied over into the comics, or I guess the comics copying over into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so again, picking up with Gamora killing Thanos, what we also find out here is it wasn't so clear cut, where she, well, no pun intended, but where she cut off his head, that Thanos actually began speaking to her telepathically. Now, this is ambiguous here, and we don't really know exactly how this falls. With Thanos sort of walking away from Mistress Death and really kind of leaving her behind, Thanos going his own way. What this basically meant was that it seems like Thanos may have been barred from the realm of Mistress Death. And if that's true, his essence may continue to live on. But historically speaking in Marvel Comics, when someone like take for example, Deadpool is barred from the realm of the dead, or even when it comes to Thanos himself, who was banned from the realm of Mistress Death, they're simply just immortal. They just can't die. Their spiritual essence doesn't live on. Their physical body just can't be destroyed. It's impossible to kill them because there's nowhere for them to go. And so it's kind of crazy here because of course, Gamora responds by wiping out the rest of the Chitauri army, and that really kind of brings them to a close. And so it switches back over to where the last story left off, when Gamora killed Star-Lord, when she killed Peter Quill. Now, of course, if you want to know what was going on there, check out the video down in the description. And of course, we also have the Infinity War playlist and so on. But where she goes to impale him, what we end up having is Doctor Strange invoking the Time Stone and stopping time. Now, this is kind of an intriguing move because of course, this is obviously, again, the Marvel Cinematic Universe being rolled in, and Doctor Strange basically saves Peter Quill. Now, of course, he doesn't heal him. That doesn't happen right off the bat. Instead, he just basically kind of saves him, and then from there, he actually goes through the process of healing him, as soon as all that's done. But it's intriguing here because not everyone knows how to react. And so what you end up having Doctor Strange basically doing is taking Turk Barrett and then whisking him off to another dimension. Now, what Doctor Strange is doing here is basically pitching a kind of a middle ground. And the reason why is, remember, Turk got the Mind Stone, and what it allowed him to do was read the minds of like stockbrokers and things like that, and start investing his money in a way that turned him into like a man who was worth, mountains and mountains of money, worth an absolute fortune. And so Doctor Strange's response is, we have to get the Infinity Stones off the planet Earth. If we have them all in a singular location, they'll be that much easier for Gamora to access. So we have to disperse them all across the cosmos and turn it into a hunt that would take her thousands of years to finally figure out. But remember, this is one of the things that I don't know if Jerry Dugan seems to forget, or if he just threw it in the story and Doctor Strange forgot. But remember, the Infinity Stones want to be brought together. We know that from Brian Michael Bendis' Illuminati run. We know it from Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers run. If you have one stone, it'll lead you to all the others because they want to be reunited. Remember, they all hail from a singular being that's constantly trying to reform itself. And where we would think that Gamora would still be basically a lost ball in high weeds trying to track these stones down, remember, she has the Power Stone in her sword. So she already has a kind of homing beacon for the rest of the Infinity Stones wherever they happen to be. The smartest decision by Doctor Strange would be to scatter them across different dimensions, to take them to like different dimensions. Now, that may very well have been the plan, and it seems like the most likely thing, at least given Doctor Strange's power, because in that case, Gamora would never be able to find them, but neither would anybody else. It would literally be everyone relying on Stephen Strange to make the decision to reform the gems, and then presumably reform the Infinity Gauntlet if the crisis was bad enough. But again, it's pretty cool here. It's pretty intriguing because in the middle of this fight, this continually going on between the Guardians of the Galaxy and this sort of hodgepodge of Earth superheroes and the various villains who were there, we end up having like Iron Man who arrives on the scene. Now again, this is coming down with the big guns. This is when the big guys are stepping in and saying, look, this has gone on long enough. In this kind of a situation, we've basically been dealing with like small fries for the most part. I mean, you got Doctor Strange, who's not really a small fry, but for the most part, it's really, small fries through everything else. And this of course leads into like Thor showing up to meet with Peter Quill, to meet with Star-Lord. Carol Danvers makes her arrival as well. But this is kind of a cool thing, and I like how Jerry Dugan does this, is he doesn't really pull any punches with the character of Gamora. And the reason why is because she's extremely capable. I mean, she got superhuman strength, speed and durability and all those different things. And while she's not necessarily a pound for pound match for Carol Danvers, or at least it doesn't really seem like she would be, Dugan really kind of like amps her powers up a little bit and actually says yes, she is. Now, of course, this also comes by way of her wielding the Power Stone, and that gives her kind of a boost to the energy that she had before. Remember, the Power Stone is basically like raw power given form. So energy projection, superhuman strength, anything that involves a power-based element, it would allow a person to amplify their abilities multiple times over. What Dugan also seems to do is sort of limit it in scope, because the Infinity Stones are not finite stones. The Infinity Stones are literally infinite, and so wielding the Power Stone gives you infinite power. Punching Carol Danvers, knocking her unconscious, it seems pretty straightforward. This of course leads to Thor throwing his hammer, Captain America throwing his shield, and everyone's looking to try to face off against Gamora and take her out. Now, this is actually a genius moment here. It's one of the coolest moments of the story, and Jerry Dugan really kind of pulls a rabbit out of his hat here. The way this goes down is you end up having Carol Danvers grabbing Gamora and whisking her into space. Now, Carol Danvers, depending on the story, depending on the circumstance, she can tap into her binary powers occasionally, and it'll allow her to like breathe in space and different things like that. When she flies Gamora up into the air, it presumably knocks her out because the oxygen is so thin, and the result is that she basically brings her back down. But notice this, it's so cool because you end up having Doctor Strange who goes to bind Gamora, and that's basically the end of that. And of course, she's basically tied up. But then she starts tapping in Morse code, and Captain America immediately picks up on this, and that's when he realizes that they've basically switched. It's actually Carol Danvers who's laying on the ground, and it's Gamora who's essentially, appearing as Carol Danvers. And the reason why is because Gamora has the Reality Stone. This is one of the coolest uses of the Reality Stone in Marvel Comics history, because you never really see it used on like a small scale. You never really see someone distort reality in such a way to make them appear to be someone else. And when Gamora realizes that Captain America, understands what's going on, she simply says, I really didn't want it to happen this way. All you had to do was play along, not ask any questions. From there, Gamora single-handedly dismantles the entirety of the Avengers team. She takes them apart piece by piece. And this is really kind of like a love letter to the Gamora fans, saying, hey, look, she's just as dangerous as you think she is. Even though she's kind of fallen back to the wayside after the events of like Annihilation Conquest, even though she hasn't really been relevant for what's essentially like 12 years, she's really been more of like a background character, a supporting character, she still is incredibly dangerous, and she still is incredibly capable in terms of her abilities. And it's cool to see, because you end up having Adam Warlock, whose head is cut off because Gamora knows that he'll just continually fight over and over and over again. Black Widow, who jumps in, you end up having like Black Panther, who shows up, and then she just freezes time and she stops everything and just says like everything is done. And then of course, you end up having Thanos, who appears to her for a moment. And so what she does is she basically, once she gets the Soul Stone from Adam Warlock, she opens a portal to Soul World. Now again, this is interesting here, because this is again Jerry Dugan really hitting at the idea and creating a story by simply saying that Gamora wasn't really as free as she thought, as we thought she was. Now again, he's also shifting up the nature of the Soul Stone, in the sense that what he seems to be doing here is saying that unlike years past where you had Soul World inside the Soul Stone, and Soul World was universal, meaning everybody saw the same thing, they could interact with each other, it'd be like walking around the city of New York. Instead, the interior of the Soul Stone seems to be relative to the person who's in it, and so nobody can interact with anybody else because they're in their own individual version of Soul World. And that's probably what you'll end up seeing basically with the events of Infinity War. What you're going to end up having here is what amounts to like Marvel Generations combined with like the events of Soul World, and then like the Ribbon or the Nexus or whatever it was from Star Trek Generations, that terrible movie. You're going to have this scenario where like you have everybody who died in Infinity War, they're going to be in their own individual Soul World, most likely, and they may not want to leave. They may think it's like actually an absolute reality. So again, it's kind of cool, and it's kind of intriguing because it leaves almost unlimited possibilities. But when Gamora goes to merge with herself, her response is, now I'm going to use the Infinity Stones, I'm going to bring them together, and I'm going to use them for a singular purpose, at which point Loki appears and says, actually, I have a much better idea on how these things can be used effectively. Okay, so picking back up again with Infinity Wars, the third installment, Infinity Wars Part 3. This really feels like it kind of spoils the ending of Avengers 4, although probably not. But Gamora again has the Infinity Stones. Now again, this is weird when it comes to Gamora's character. She's always been solid. Like Gamora's always been like pretty solid, but it seems like such a sudden shift. It's just kind of weird to see her shift up like this. But the idea is that she's wielding all the Infinity Stones, and basically Loki had tried to find some way to barter with her. Now, this is kind of the funny thing, is because Gamora's been around, she's been around the block block more than a few times. So she's familiar, not really super familiar with Loki, but she's familiar with people like Loki. And so where Loki pops up and he's just kind of whispering these honeyed words and so on and so forth, she immediately sees right through it. Because remember, the goal of Loki is to figure out what in the world is going on here in terms of how to basically stop it all happening. Because when he received a vision, I guess really when he was met with an alternate reality version of himself, we ended up finding out this battle is raging, this exact kind of battle is raging across the entirety of the multiverse. And in fact, the way that this plays out is Thanos' kind of essence, or his invisible spirit, his consciousness or whatever, appears to Gamora, and it says, with the Infinity Stones, you would be able to peer into other universes and see if this is true. Now, this is new. This is not something we'd ever seen before. The Infinity Stones historically never allowed anybody to do anything that would in any form or fashion impact other universes. It doesn't work that way. That was really kind of solidified during Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers when Captain America tried to push another universe away and destroy the gems in the process. So it's just one of these things where it only allows you to manipulate and control the fundamental forces of a particular universe. So in reality, it's really kind of Jerry Dugan cooking the books a little bit in order to tell the story, but it works because when they peer into another universe, there is a character that's known as Requiem, but it's not Gamora. It's somebody else entirely. Now, who that person is never revealed to us, but Gamora herself really kind of like disregards this and says, I don't really care. Like, that doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm controlling this universe right now. This universe is the only one that I'm worried about. Now, this is kind of cool because under normal circumstances, somebody else may have gone to investigate, like someone like Thor or somebody like Captain America or somebody along those lines. Even a villain like Ultron may have been like, well, if I can look into other universes, I can conquer other universes, and then just kind of go from there. But for Gamora, she's very on the nose, very cutthroat, and very straight and narrow. And so in this circumstance, it's basically, I'm only worried about what I can see and what I can do here. I'm not going to be distracted by anything else, which is kind of cool because following that, she basically releases everybody from the Time Stone because they've basically been frozen in time this whole time. She releases everybody from the Time Stone and then says, all of you guys are going to end up getting in my way. I'm going to fold space onto itself. Now, we're not really, that's kind of the crazy thing. We're not really given a motivation for why she's really doing any of this. She just is. And that's why it's kind of crazy, is because her pursuit of the Infinity Stones, really the Soul Stone, seemed to be based on the idea that she was trying to reclaim a portion of herself that had always been trapped in there ever since she, Adam Warlock, and Pip the Troll first entered. And so that made sense. Now, she's just doing it for the sake of doing it. And there doesn't really seem to be a reason why. She's just kind of folding the universe in half because whatever the story needs to be told. So it's kind of strange that she would be the one to do all this. It's kind of a weird scenario, but nonetheless, and going through and basically saying that you guys have become more or less a hassle, you as superheroes, I'm going to fold the universe in on itself, and then whatever happens, happens. What she doesn't foresee is that they all begin to kind of merge into each other. This is Jerry Dugan really grabbing a page out of the old Amalgam comics. For those of you guys who don't know what that is, back in the day, Marvel and DC had a couple different crossovers. You had Marvel versus DC, and then you had JLA Avengers, Justice League of America and the Avengers. The Marvel versus DC was actually the better one. JLA Avengers was okay, but what you ended up getting out of that was you basically had Amalgam, and it was a universe where the heroes were merged, where you had like Darkclaw, which was Batman and Wolverine merged into a singular person, just different things like that. And it was cool for what it was, but this is kind of a page out of that. The difference here is that it's isolated strictly to Marvel Comics. And so where these characters are really just kind of relegated and they're sort of confined, the first person we end up picking up with in this kind of new universe here is really like Captain America and Doctor Strange, really Private Stephen Rogers, who have been merged into a singular being together. And it's kind of a cool thing because this creates a whole universe unto itself. Now, this is very House of M in terms of how all this goes on. The difference between this story and House of M is House of M was a lot more complex. It was a lot more sprawled out. It was a lot more in depth, and there was a lot more going on there. I mean, you read like the main House of M stories, it's like 7 issues long or 6 issues long or however many issues it is, maybe like 12. I can't remember off the top of my head. You read all the tie-ins, you're getting into like the 150 issue range, and the tie-ins expand the whole thing. They give you like this whole universe of House of M, the whole reality and how everything had changed and all that stuff. And it was pretty cool for what it was. It was reminiscent of like Age of Apocalypse or something like that. But for Gamora, she didn't actually expect this to happen. She didn't actually expect that the characters would merge together. And this is a small but noticeable thing, because what it means is that Gamora did not consider all ends. And that makes sense, because when it comes to someone like Thanos, he's been in control of absolute power a whole bunch of times, but he's also lived for so long. Thanos is old. He's thousands of years old. And so when you're talking about someone who is that old, you're talking about a guy who's been across the universe, who's had a lot of time to expand his knowledge, expand his experience, and who's coming to the table with more than just, I want to have the Infinity Stones and I want to wipe out half the life of the universe. You have a guy that has like far more motivation and is far more complex and in-depth than that. And so he's able to view things from perspectives that Gamora couldn't consider because she hasn't had the experience to give her a reason to consider it. And so it's kind of cool because from there, you end up having Loki who basically says, look, what you have there is you have the God Quarry. You know, on the far edge of the universe, you've got the God Quarry. Below that is the Quarry of Creation. And it's basically a new concept, really kind of seeming to hit on the idea that all the universes that exist in Marvel Comics all stem from the Quarry of Creation. Now, we don't really know what it is. We don't know how this whole thing functions. We don't know what process it serves. And we'll find out, you know, as the story goes on. But it's kind of cool because from here, having Gamora peek into this universe that she's basically made and looking at everything that's going on, we have like Iron Man and Thor who merge into one. You've got Black Panther and Ghost Rider who merge. Black Panther's riding like an actual panther, which looks pretty badass. You have what looks like Scarlet Witch and X-23 who merge. It's kind of a cool thing. It actually looks pretty awesome. And it sucks that it's so short-lived. I mean, we do get the Infinity Warps, which give you the story of all those characters and so on, which we will cover. But still, with Loki trying to more or less swindle his way in, book passage alongside Gamora in order to access the God Quarry and the Quarry of Creation, ultimately, he's basically set aside by Gamora. Her response is, you are not coming here because you are dubious, you are a person who tricks, you are a person that cannot be believed, and ultimately I believe that your basis or your entire existence is nefarious. And so Loki himself is confined to this new universe. Now, it's kind of a weird thing because the way this is done, we don't know exactly how Gamora resides. If the universe has been folded in on itself, that would mean she was folded along with it, but there's no indication she stands outside of the universe. And if that's true, if she does stand outside the universe, then things get a little hairy because at that point, technically speaking, the Infinity Stones should shut off. They should just cease to work. And she's just a person kind of floating out in oblivion. So it's a little strange in terms of how this happens. But again, the other half of this could very well be the universe itself isn't properly folded. She just screwed up all the heroes, which serves its purpose and it works for what it is. But from there, you basically end up picking up with her traveling to the God Quarry alongside the guy that basically, you know, travels with Loki, the Chronicler, more or less. And then you end up having Loki who travels directly to go see the X-Men. Now, this is where Loki kind of goes back into being his normal self, where he goes to visit what passes for the X-Men here and actually comes across Dupepool. Now, Dupepool is a combination of Dupe and Deadpool, and Dupe is amazing. Dude, I love Dupe. He's like this Omega level character that just like never got fully fleshed out, and he had all kinds of crazy powers. He was part of X-Statix for a little while, but Dupe is awesome. Dude, I love Dupe. Like he's like, Wolverine's the only one who ever understands him. Like it's one of the craziest things. Wolverine's the only one that can understand his language. Nobody ever understands anything he says, but Dupe is awesome. Like I love the character of Dupe. I feel like we should do a video on him, you know, just like cover his story or something along those lines, like the origin of Dupe. I don't know if he actually has a definitive origin or not. I guess we should look that up. But still, with Loki showing up to meet Wolverine, we end up finding out that this is basically Wolverine and Emma Frost merged into a singular person, which is kind of strange because you would think it would be Emma Frost and Cyclops, but it's basically Wolverine and Emma Frost merged into a singular person, which means that it's all the abilities of Wolverine combined with the really Omega level telepathy, this super powerful telepathy of Emma Frost, which is kind of cool because when Emma Frost scans the mind of Loki, Emma Frost, or I guess really Wolverine, realizes Loki's telling the truth, but ultimately shuts his door in the face and says, I don't want to have anything to do with what's going on here. You know, let sleeping dogs lie, let our universe be the way it is. So again, it seems very House of M in the sense that Wolverine has no idea how things are supposed to be. Instead, he's just kind of like, well, you know, like this is the universe the way it's always been. The difference is that in the House of M universe, Wolverine woke up realizing things weren't right. Like he woke up realizing things aren't the way they're supposed to be, and he was a way for Bendis to kind of write it into the story. But here it seems like Wolverine, alongside everybody else, is totally aware of what's going on. Like he's totally aware of the fact that like this reality seems to be an absolute truth. He doesn't know anything outside of that. So it's kind of cool and it's kind of interesting. But again, it's really left to Loki to try to find some way to basically save his universe and kind of, you know, set this one back to the way that it's supposed to be. It's kind of crazy, but honestly, I have no idea what direction it's going to take. Okay, so we are getting into Infinity Wars Part 4. And again, this is kind of interesting. This is, issue number 4 is a little strange. It's more of like plot building, but it's kind of crazy because in truth, it feels a little bit rushed. What Jerry Dugan does here is he actually kind of takes a couple concepts from House of M. A lot of people know what House of M is, right? It's a story where Scarlet Witch warps reality and then creates a new one, and then, or really she eliminates the current reality, then creates a new one where like everybody's most subconscious dreams come true, essentially. But in this one, Gamora with the Infinity Stones had basically merged all these heroes together. So quote unquote, cut the universe's population in half by like merging people together and then threw them all in Soul World and then created like a whole universe within Soul World. And so it's kind of interesting because initially Dugan didn't really seem to explain that. Traditionally, Soul World is like its own world, right? It has like rivers and streams and mountains and so on and so forth, and it was always depicted a certain way. Then Marvel came back later and basically turned Soul World into the Marvel Cinematic Universe version of Soul World. And so what it kind of happened here is it was like Gamora had sent all these characters into Soul World and then built a house in Soul World and then put them all inside the house. So they don't really know what Soul World looks like. They're not really familiar with it. Instead, they're all just kind of residing in this universe she threw in there. Now, by merging them all together, Marvel gave us Infinity Warps. At the end of the day, it wasn't really meant to be taken seriously, and I may or may not cover it. I don't really know. I mean, I don't really care much about the characters in Infinity Warps, but one of the characters that was, or really a couple characters that were merged here, were Wolverine and Emma Frost. And of course, we talked about that in the last video, that with Wolverine and Emma Frost being sort of merged together, it's Wolverine with Emma Frost telepathy. And initially, Loki was one of the characters who had been thrown into this universe when Gamora sort of changed everything. And so Loki was like the only person that truly knew what was going on. But in this instance, with Loki speaking directly with Wolverine, it's just kind of this thing where like Wolverine had scanned his mind. He basically read his mind to see what was going on. Not only that, one of the things that Jerry Dugan introduces here is something called Devandra. And Devandra is essentially this object or this concept that's created for the purpose of like consuming the occupants of Soul World. Now again, this is Jerry Dugan sort of making things up, or at least creating new things. Because remember, Soul World was a very peaceful place. Contrary to the way in which a person would arrive in Soul World, which is to say the Soul Stone would literally siphon off their soul until the whole thing was absorbed and then their soul resided in Soul World proper. In this, Devandra is kind of like this being that was either created by Gamora or has always existed. And we'll talk more about the role Devandra plays and with regards to the story here in a little bit. But like Devandra just kind of shows up, or at least one of the aspects of Devandra shows up. And of course, it's basically fought off by the combined efforts of Loki and Wolverine and Emma Frost brought together. And so what ends up happening is that sort of in the middle of all this, you end up having like Wolverine, who, Diamond Patch, who basically says, look, I'll send a thought to myself, or I'll remind myself of something, send a thought to myself to a version of myself in the future of this universe, which basically merges with the Phoenix Force. Now, this is not new. This is not Jerry Dugan sort of just grabbing it out of nowhere. This is actually going on in the Thor comic books, the Mighty Thor comic books, as a backup feature. But nonetheless, with this version appearing out of nowhere, it's just kind of like, hey, look, I could basically fix this for you, or at least, separate Wolverine and Emma Frost, and then just sort of go from there. Now, this is Jerry Dugan kind of playing it fast and loose with the Phoenix. The Phoenix's power has always been ambiguous. For those of you guys who are new to Marvel, the Phoenix's powers are really one of those things where it's just like whatever a writer wants the Phoenix Force to do is what the Phoenix Force can do. Its power is technically limitless. Like that's kind of something that's been established over the years. The other half of this is the Phoenix Force, or at least this future version of Wolverine with the Phoenix Force, also has the Power Stone. And so that's one of the things that's kind of hit on here. And that's where you sort of get a little bit of Secret Wars and a little bit of House of M brought in here. In the sense that in Secret Wars, you had an Infinity Gauntlet that was assembled because the Secret Wars event, the Battle World, basically dealt with like all these different universes sort of housed together. And so it was a different Infinity Stone from the various universes that were all brought together to create a unifying Infinity Gauntlet. In this instance, if a new universe is created, then a new set of Infinity Stones has to exist in that universe. Now remember, it didn't originally work that way. When it came to the Infinity Stones, back in the Thanos quest stories, Thanos had basically laid out the origin of the Infinity Stones. Like some being existed before all things and it was lonely, and then basically channeled its energy, or the fastest of its energy, into the Infinity Stones and dispersed them across the universe. And then that goes into the future stories of Marvel, where every universe has its own Infinity Gauntlet, and the Infinity Gauntlet will only work in that one universe. This changes that. What the entire basis behind Infinity Wars does is it changes it entirely and says, well, the Reality Stone will actually let you jump from one universe to the next, which technically is not supposed to happen. So again, it's Jerry Dugan sort of shifting things up. But with the Power Stone being used, this allows a user to, again, amplify their own power and manipulate the powers of others. And while it is kind of a stretch here, Jerry Dugan uses this to say that a person with the Power Stone can split those who are merged to split them apart. And so this is kind of borrowing from House of M, right? Like the House of M event basically established that like a new universe was created. Nobody remembered how things were supposed to be except for Wolverine. And then Wolverine basically woke up really alongside Layla Miller, woke up Emma Frost. Emma Frost started using her telepathy to wake up other people. And that led to, the House of M being changed back to the main Marvel universe in the Scarlet Witch took away all the mutants' powers, or at least 98% of the mutant population's powers. It really kind of invokes those things and brings them in. It's just one of those things where stories kind of build on each other in that capacity. Now, following this, with the Power Stone being given to Loki, Emma Frost takes it because she's kind of like, I don't trust you, man. And there's no reason for her to. Not only that, Wolverine goes to basically open the refrigerator and another aspect of Devondra shows up. And this is one of the things that Jerry Dugan doesn't really explain. He doesn't really tell us if Devondra is more of like a hive mind concept, you know, like we are all Devondra, all these different, you know, spiders, kind of soul-eating entities that exist out there are all just Devondra as kind of like a hive mind existing in different aspects, or if there really is one Devondra out there and these are all just like fractions of itself. We're not really given an explanation to that. But Wolverine kind of faces off against these things and then basically seems to get eaten. And then you have Emma Frost who takes the Power Stone and she alongside Loki basically leave. Now, at this point, we switch over to Gamora. Now, where everything that goes on, that at least that we've talked about so far, takes place in Soul World, where Gamora is in alternate universe. In this alternate reality, this is one that we talked about before, where this alternate universe version of Loki had basically managed to access or at least pick up Thor's hammer and then is powered by all the Infinity Stones. The difference here seems to be like Gamora taking the hammer of Thor, which is interesting to see that she's worthy, but it's kind of fudging the numbers a bit. We know just from like Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers that not every hammer of Thor in every universe is the same. We saw like a different universe where there was a version of Thor who was unworthy and the hammer was made for an unworthy Thor. So we've seen them like shift around and change around a little bit, but Gamora taking the hammer of Thor seems to give her the upper hand on this version of Loki, and in turn she goes and attacks him. And of course, she kills him in the process. Now in this alternate reality, in the previous video, we'd also talked about how we had Phyla-Vell and we had Moondragon. And I want to offer a little more of an explanation on these characters. So in Marvel Comics, originally, you had the original Captain Marvel of the Kree Empire, and he was popular for a time, but when his popularity started waning, Marvel killed him off in 1984 with his own self-titled Death Book, which was written by Jim Starlin. And so following that, there wasn't really a Captain Marvel for a few years. I mean, you had like Monica Rambeau who took up the mantle, and then after her, you had Genus Vell. And Genus Vell was okay. I mean, he wasn't really like that great of a Captain Marvel. It was Marvel's attempt to basically try to find a way to like replace the original Marvel, and for the most part, they didn't really seem to enjoy the character until you got to Phyla-Vell. And the way this played out was that in 2004, as part of Joe Quesada's grand scheme to rework Marvel Comics entirely, what they did is they had the fourth volume of the Marvel series that starred Genus Vell. He went nuts. And he was manipulated by cosmic entities and then like recreated reality. And in this new universe that was created, you essentially ended up having like the version of, you know, Alicia, I think it was Alicia or Elysium, who originally created Genus Vell, who created another version called Phyla-Vell. And so, as a result of this, you kind of had two versions in the same universe. And then when everything was set back to normal, Phyla-Vell came with him. And that was basically Marvel's attempt to kind of back end a new Captain Marvel with the intention of killing off Genus Vell and having Phyla-Vell take up the mantle for herself. That was Marvel Comics' way of introducing a new version of the character going into Annihilation. The whole idea of Dan Abnett sort of consolidating the entire Marvel landscape, the entire Marvel cosmic landscape, which came with Annihilation. So that's why you had like a lot of those huge cosmic scopes that were going on with Annihilation, Annihilation Conquest, the restoration of the Nova Corps, then its entire decimation, and so on and so forth. That's why that story is so singularly important. But Phyla-Vell was very popular. Really, she still is, depending on, at least in certain circles. Now, of course, Moondragon has a far more in-depth history than Phyla-Vell. Moondragon is Heather Douglas. She's the daughter of Drax the Destroyer, and it was believed that she was killed when Thanos showed up on Earth for the first time to kind of access the Cosmic Cube, and had killed Arthur Douglas, who was resurrected as Drax, for the purpose of killing Thanos. Heather was taken to Titan by the father of Thanos and then raised to be someone who could defeat him. She's one of the most powerful telepathic characters in Marvel Comics, but she died a long time ago. She died well, not really a long time. She died during the events of Annihilation Conquest, I'm pretty sure is when she was killed. But the fact remains that for her and Phyla-Vell, they were a romantic couple. Like they were together. They had a really strong romantic chemistry, which was one of the things you didn't see that often at Marvel at the time, and people really did enjoy it. But again, kind of enough expose about these two characters. What Jerry Dugan does is he actually plays it pretty smart. Because of the fact that the Reality Stone is missing from Phyla-Vell, you end up having like Gamora, who kind of reads her mind with the intention of finding its location, and then in turn, like Moondragon sort of engages in like this telepathic battle. And the result is that Gamora learns the location of the Reality Stone, and then Moondragon's more or less overpowered. And then in an effort to try to destroy Gamora, Phyla-Vell jumps into the conflict, and ultimately, of course, Gamora comes out on top. And so that leads to both Moondragon and Phyla-Vell using the power at their disposal to basically kind of crack a fissure in the alternate reality, and then enter into Soul World. Now the question is, why does this matter? Because this is kind of a backdoor way for Jerry Dugan to bring these characters back, to basically say, okay, so like now they're in Soul World, so when quote unquote everything gets set back, they'll come with it. Presumably they'll come with it. But following this, it really turns into Emma Frost and Loki just traveling around and waking people up. So of course you had Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, who was merged with Kang the Conqueror, kind of a time-traveling villain. The Incredible Hulk, who's merged with Ant-Man, so it's like a mini Hulk, which is kind of cool. He's like talking so much trash, and he's like 3 inches tall. But again, like when they're they're split up. It's one of these things where like Infinity Warps was very, very short-lived. Now, Loki's plan is to kind of create not really a new Infinity Watch, but to bring back individuals who are particularly suited to wield the Infinity Stones. Each one of them are going to wield an Infinity Stone. And that's one thing to bear in mind. The Infinity Stones aren't attuned, right? It's not like those individuals who are really, really strong telepaths are best suited for the Mind Stone. Those individuals who are like magic wielders are suited for the Reality Stone. It'd be cool if Marvel kind of lined them up that way, but that was never really the case. It was just kind of like, hey man, you get an Infinity Stone, you get to be part of the Infinity Watch. And it's like, hooray, you know, and that's really about it. But again, you have, you know, once they actually leave this sort of pocket dimension inside Soul World and then travel into Soul World proper, Adam Warlock's basically being like eaten by one of these giant spiders, and Scott Lang shrinks down, jumps inside the spider, grows to a gigantic size, and then frees Adam Warlock in the process. It's pretty fast paced. And so in response to this, Emma Frost's stance is, well, we need more people. Like, we need more people to fight alongside us. And so she basically starts waking up or really contacting all these people in Infinity Warps, and then just kind of brings them all into the larger conflict. And we don't really know what the basis behind this is. We can largely assume she's forming an army, and then she's going to split them all and double their numbers, set them back to the way they were before, that kind of a thing. But again, it's very akin to House of M in that regard, waking characters up to who they truly are, separating them, so on and so forth. And so from there, you go to Gamora and Flower, again, you know, the guy who was from Asgard, and basically like going into the Well of Creation. And when they get there, what we end up learning here is that from Gamora's perspective, this Devondra entity, this Devondra being, which it doesn't seem as though she created, will basically go through and consume all these souls inside of this dimension in Soul World. And when its hunger satiated, it'll basically spin a new universe. And so it's kind of strange here, and it doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense. It kind of seems like Jerry Dugan's just kind of telling a story for the sake of telling a story. But when this new universe is created, Gamora will in turn enter it and then take control of it and then create it according to her own whims and wants, which really kind of begs the question, why doesn't she just do that with the existing universe inside of Soul World? I have no idea. The story has to be told. I have no real clue here. Again, it may be one of these things where like Dugan's kind of going through, and then it'll like the final issue will be a kind of tell-all in terms of what all's going on here. But it's very confusing. It's very cloak and dagger. It's really kind of all over the place. And this one seems to be kind of just spinning its wheels. But again, you know, what we end up having is that with Devondra going through and just kind of consuming all these souls, again, like normal human beings inside this dimension in Soul World, with a lot of the superheroes basically making it out alive, we end up having like Gamora just kind of biding her time and just sort of waiting for Devondra to finish what she's doing, at which point the entire set of events is being watched by the Watchers. Now, we don't really know what this means. Again, there's a lot of unanswered questions in this story. We don't know if the Watchers being here is for the purpose of just watching things unfold. We don't know if they're actually going to act, because remember, when the Watchers appear in Marvel Comics, it's basically like a huge thing is about to happen. There's going to be like this huge paradigm shift, but we don't really know what all it means. Really, Uatu the Watcher's been dead since the events of Original Sin. So there's one here who actually looks exactly like Uatu, the one with the fire coming out of his head. He looks exactly like Uatu, which means this version may have come back, or it's just a whole different version of his character. We don't really know. A lot of unanswered questions. This seems like one of those stories that Marvel's writing for the sake of writing it, just to kind of like set everything back to rights. So it's kind of like, hey, so what if Infinity Gauntlet ended with like a reboot, more or less? Like, what if we did what we were supposed to do after the events of Secret Wars and actually reboot the universe? We don't know if that's the case. It's kind of strange in terms of how all this is happening. But again, you know, this is one of those stories where it's just kind of informational in the middle ground. Not a whole lot really happens, and just kind of setting the stage for things to come. So picking up with Infinity Wars Part 5, again, in this part, we really kind of pick up in Soul World. Now, again, these guys are all fighting Devondra, and again, this is kind of a new introduction here by Jerry Dugan, and that's one of the crazy things, is a lot of stuff is being changed here. That's one of the things we talked about in the previous videos, is a lot of things are being changed here. Soul World never looks like this. Now, of course, we can basically attribute this to the fact that the Marvel Comics is now copying the Marvel Cinematic Universe as opposed to the Marvel Cinematic Universe copying Marvel Comics. But the overall gist here is that with Devondra is basically this entity that exists to kind of go through and consume everything inside of Soul World, which is kind of strange because from what we've gathered so far, Gamora has basically acquired the Soul Stones for herself to kind of recreate the universe. But in order to do this, in order to get the heroes out of the way, she can find them all to Soul World and then accidentally merge them all together in the first place. Which kind of begs the question, why didn't she just wipe them all out with the Infinity Gems? You know, with the Infinity Gauntlet. Probably because we already saw Thanos do that once, and I guess you can't do the same gag twice. But nonetheless, while all that fight is going on between the merged heroes and Devondra, you end up having having Emma Frost, Miss Marvel, Kane the Conqueror, Ant-Man, Scott Lang, Loki, and the Incredible Hulk, who were kind of off on a mission of their own. Now, we don't know the specifics of this mission. It's just one of the things where Emma Frost is just kind of like, hey, we have to go to this particular location. Now, that's one of the things to bear in mind here. Jerry Dugan kind of does a lot of hand waving in terms of like why things are happening. Like, why is Emma Frost going to this location? How do all these things unfold? It's just kind of like, well, I mean, you know, they are. And that's just kind of, you kind of have to run with it. But the location they're traveling to is basically where you have Child Gamora hanging out. Now, again, we don't know how Child Gamora got here. From what we're being told, you know, from what we've seen so far, that the older version of Gamora, who was confined to Soul World, she was there because in the old school comics, when you had Adam Warlock and Pip the Troll and Gamora, who operated as kind of the early days of the Infinity Watch, when they were confined within Soul World, that Gamora, when she left, had left a piece of herself behind. So it sort of made sense that it worked that way, and it just kind of always been that way. Why Child Gamora is here, we're not entirely sure, but the explanation is offered almost immediately, and that's kind of the cool little bit here. What we end up finding out is that when Gamora basically took all the various heroes and put them inside Soul World, that included a portion of herself, a piece of herself. Now again, it's one of the things where Gamora didn't really seem to recognize it, didn't really seem to notice it, and again, a little bit of hand waving going on here. But one of the things that we have is Child Gamora playing with a set of Infinity Stones. Now, this is new. This is really Jerry Dugan just kind of cooking the books a little bit, and that's one of the things to bear in mind. Again, we've talked about this in previous videos, but when it comes to the Infinity Stones, they only work in their own universe, and a universe only ever has one set of Infinity Stones. The Marvel Cinematic Universe only has one set of Infinity Stones. The main Marvel Universe only has one set of Infinity Stones. The Ultimate Universe, all these different alternate realities, there's no universe that exists in Marvel Comics where you have more than one set of Infinity Stones. But because of the fact that Gamora had basically created kind of like a duplicate, so to speak, of the main Marvel Universe, and then threw it all into Soul World, that came with the Infinity Stones as well. So she basically created new stones using existing Infinity Stones. That's not supposed to be able to happen. You know, it's like wishing for more wishes when it comes to a genie. Sure, it's a cool idea to have, but at the end of the day, it's not something that can actually be done. From there, Loki ends up basically dispersing the Infinity Stones among the various members of the team, of what's really kind of like this ramshackle Infinity Watch. Now, it's kind of interesting here, because what Loki says is these stones, the Infinity Stones themselves, aren't operating the way they're normally supposed to, that they're kind of different from what we're used to. And so what he basically says is that where we would normally expect Emma Frost to get the Mind Stone because she's such a high-level telepath, or we would expect the Incredible Hulk to get the Power Stone because he's just raw, infinite strength. Instead, Loki starts switching things up and says, actually, Emma Frost is going to get a different stone. The Incredible Hulk's going to get a different, he'll get like the Space Stone, different things like that. That it's all going to kind of shift up from the normal status quo because each stone serves a particular purpose. And so what seems to be going on here is Loki's hitting at the idea that they're basically getting the stones because they're serving a purpose, as opposed to, something that inherently would allow them to build on their own power, which again is kind of apart from the status quo, but it still works. Not only that, these stones, because they basically manipulate the universe, basically allow them to leave Soul World. Now, in truth, that's possible. That's entirely possible. For example, if you had the Infinity Stone, the Space Stone, you could use that to enter Asgard if you wanted to. That's entirely possible. That's one of the things to bear in mind, guys, is that what you have, if you were to imagine like a plate, for example, just like a dinner plate, and on that plate you have that plate is like the main Marvel Universe. Then on that plate you have like Asgard, and you've got Olympus where the Greek gods dwell, and you've got the realm of Dormammu. Using the Space Stone, you can go anywhere in that universe. You can hop, skip, and jump anywhere within the realm of that universe to go from like one dimension to another. We've never really seen anybody do that before because the story's never called for it, but it's entirely possible, and it's within the possibility of those Infinity Stones to pull that off. And that's the reason why in this particular story, while the Infinity Stones are using do originate in Soul World, Soul World itself is still part of the universe. So they're basically inside a dimension inside the main Marvel Universe. They can just leave that dimension and go back into the main Marvel Universe. And that's exactly what they do. They immediately enter into the realm of Gamora, who's basically hanging out at the Quarry of Creation, fighting, Phyla-Vell and Moondragon. Of course, this leads to the arrival of Emma Frost and so on and so forth, all of whom start facing off against Gamora. Now, under normal circumstances, they would never be able to stop her. They would never be able to defeat Gamora because of the stones she wields. But because they have Infinity Stones that make them her equal, then what this now means is they can use them for her, they can literally go toe-to-toe with her and ultimately come out on top. Now, this is also a very important thing to bear in mind here, is that when it comes to the Infinity Stones, just because a person possesses them does not mean they can use them to their full potential. That's one of the big differences. That's one of the things that Thanos hit on during the original Gauntlet story by Jim Starlin. Thanos has been around for a long time, for like hundreds, if not thousands of years. He's been around for a very, very, very long time, and he's acquired all kinds of knowledge on a wide array of different things. And so using his intelligence, when he accesses the Infinity Gauntlet, he can use it to its full potential because he's so durable. He can withstand the extreme power it possesses. He won't go crazy by, manipulating reality using the reality stone. That was established during the events of Thanos' quest when he first gained the gauntlet in the first place, when he started going through and tracking down the stones. But then you look at someone like Parker Robbins, you look at someone like Tony Stark, you look at members of the Infinity Watch like Hulk or somebody like that, and they can't really use the stone to its full potential because, in truth, they're just not smart enough. They don't really have the mental faculties to pull it off. Someone like Reed Richards could do it. We've seen him wield the Infinity Gauntlet. But again, for someone like Gamora, she's not dumb, but she's certainly not on the same level as like Thanos in terms of intellect or the capability necessary to handle the full-on might of the Infinity Gauntlet. So while she can do some pretty impressive things, she's not using the stones at like 100%. She's using them at probably like 70 or 80% or something like that. And so the result is that she's able to hold her own. But if this was Thanos in this situation, he would have destroyed them all. He would have found a way to destroy Emma Frost and all those different characters, and they would have been wiped out, quick, fast, and in a hurry. So again, Gamora is overpowered pretty readily. And it's kind of cool to see the Incredible Hulk with a space stone, literally just like ripping her apart, like just flying basically and throwing her into everything. But the other half of this is, remember, Loki's got a mission of his own to basically capture, to kind of recreate Mjolnir, or at least gain some version of Mjolnir and gain his own Infinity Stones, gain the Infinity Stones for himself. And that's what he does. While everyone is facing off against Gamora, what Loki does is he starts traveling around and basically snatching the Infinity Stones off of people, basically just like palming them and tricking people into believing that he's just kind of working on their side. He steals from Miss Marvel, he steals from Scott Lang, does the same thing to Kane the Conqueror and Emma Frost, literally takes all their Infinity Stones and then teleports away. And so then it's just kind of like, okay, well then what in the world's going on here? Not only that, when Loki gets to whatever this dimension is that he's at, inside what seems to be this quarry of creation, it's lined with Infinity Stones. There's a ton of Infinity Stones there. So again, the plot thickens. We don't really know exactly what it is that's taking place here. This is kind of the quarry of creation of like the multiverse, but we don't really know to what extent all this is beginning to unfold. Not only that, the stones themselves are powerless inside the quarry of creation. So again, this seems to exist outside of the multiverse, which makes sense. I don't know how you really create the multiverse while you're inside of it. You kind of have to be outside of it, like the Beyondverse or something along those lines. And so it's kind of a tail end here. Again, things are left pretty ambiguous. We basically end up picking up with like Drax the Destroyer with Arthur Douglas, but this is back when he was in his human form. Now, for those of you guys who are not familiar with this, the character of Drax the Destroyer was a guy named Arthur. Moondragon is his biological daughter named Heather. The way this originally played out in Marvel Comics was that Thanos had launched an invasion against Earth, and when he did, he had come across Drax the Destroyer and come across Arthur and like destroyed his car in the process. And when that happened, Arthur was dead, Heather was believed to have been dead, and of course the wife was killed. And what ended up going on here is we basically had Heather, who was taken away by the father of Thanos, and then her telepathy was essentially unlocked, and she was trained to become one of the most powerful telepaths in Marvel Comics. And then you ended up having Arthur Douglas, who was basically resurrected from the dead by Kronos, the god for I guess one of the cosmic entities, and in turn was transformed into Drax the Destroyer and given the sole purpose of basically tracking down Thanos and destroying him. This situation does not unfold the same way. They do crash into a tree, but when they do, the tree is Groot. And that's when Arthur basically begins to say things like, I know this tree, I know this guy. So he's basically having flashbacks to his life as Drax the Destroyer. So again, this seems to take place inside of Soul World, but it's very, very ambiguous. There's a lot of cloak and dagger going on here. We don't really know exactly what's taking place. It's very, very far-fetched. It's really kind of out there and even a little bit confusing, but it is somewhat interesting. It's one of these stories where Jerry Dugan's just kind of like, things are happening, and like you'll have to read the next issue to find out, which is of course the finale. Again, it's kind of crazy to see this whole scenario unfold. It's kind of wild to see it all take place. But again, let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Okay, so jumping back into the events of Infinity Wars, to kind of get you guys caught up for a second, essentially what's going on here is we only really have like 3 worlds going on right now. Like from the perspective of this story, we're only dealing with 3 universes. There's still an infinite number of universes out there, but from this perspective, we're only dealing with 3 universes right now. The main Marvel universe has really just kind of been annihilated in its entirety. Then you have Soul World, and then you have, of course, the Quarry of Creation. And again, like we've talked about this in the previous videos, that with Soul World, Soul World was never a whole universe, right? Like Soul World was just like a little pocket dimension. Like imagine that you lived in a universe that was the size of like New York City. And that's basically what Soul World was. It was a tiny little localized space inside of the Soul Stone. And it was kept small because so few people ever wielded it that the space that was needed to house them was always very, very small. But the fact remains, Loki had basically taken the Infinity Stones as they existed in the real world, in the main Marvel universe, and basically stole them from everybody in Soul World. But then you've also got a second set set of Infinity Stones that reside within Soul World. And so what had basically gone on here is that with Loki taking these stones and then leaving for the purpose of trying to achieve whatever this greater goal happened to be, with us never really being told what it was, as soon as he gets out into the main Marvel universe, what we end up finding out is there's nothing there anymore, that all you really have is just kind of like this huge, vast, empty space. And then you have the Celestials themselves. And the Celestials never talk. And that's one of the things to bear in mind when it comes to the Celestials in Marvel Comics. And that's why when Loki addresses them, they never speak to him. And instead, one of them just kind of points over to a particular direction. Loki goes and looks. He looks into a mirror. We don't see what Loki sees. That's never offered as an explanation to us. He's basically, he kind of pulls back the tapestry and he sees what awaits for him. And then he basically just kind of quits. He basically gives up and says, yep, that's pretty much it. And it's kind of lackluster. In reality, it makes sense if that's something that's revealed later on down the line, but it's not. Loki just pulls back the tapestry and just says, yep, so this is basically kind of like a zero sum, and then leaves. And it really seems more like Jerry Dugan's way of just kind of saying, okay, we have to wrap this up somehow, and we can't really explore what goes on with Loki, so we'll just kind of write it off, we'll be done, and then Loki will leave, and that will be it. So he essentially comes back with the Soul Stones from Soul World, because of course they work within that localized space and work within the quarry of creation. And when he brings them back, they're basically given to what's left of Adam Warlock's Infinity Watch team, and then Loki just kind of jumps on his boat and then just sails off back to Omnipotent City, and that's the end of that. It's kind of weird. It really kind of seems to come out of left field. But the fact remains that going back to Soul World, again, you have Devondra, and that's kind of the interesting thing. This is one of the interesting things that Jerry Dugan did. He's very much taking a page out of Jim Starlin. And what I mean here is that for years and years, for decades, Galactus just had this hunger. And more often than not, the hunger of Galactus was attributed to the fact that he was born out of a dead universe into a new one. And the role he plays is to basically ensure that like the celestial population doesn't go unchecked when they plant their seeds inside of a planet, so that planet will give birth to a new celestial. Galactus goes around and consumes planets, so the celestials don't just plant their seed everywhere and then you've got a universe overrun with celestials. When Jim Starlin came along and wrote the Thanos miniseries, what he established was that the hunger of Galactus was actually like an other dimensional entity. Now, it was a terrible story and it was a terrible idea, but Jerry Dugan's kind of taking a page out of that by saying that the reason why the Soul Stone hungers for souls is because it houses the being Devondra. And that had never really been explained up to this point. It was just the being Devondra is there. And we were never really given an explanation of what role Devondra plays, outside of the fact that it just consumes everything inside. And what seems to have gone on here is that where the Soul Stone came into existence when the entity Nemesis scattered its essence across the universe in the form of the Infinity Stones, that when the Soul Stone came into existence, Devondra was born inside the Soul Stone. And when that happened, Devondra had a constant hunger to consume souls. The difference here is that when Infinity Wars happened and Gamora basically took all the life in the main Marvel universe, put it all inside of the Soul World, and then bent it onto itself to basically start merging people in order to essentially conserve space, that what this did is it basically opened Devondra up to the idea that there's just like all these different beings that are out there now that it can eat. So it just kind of went on like a feeding frenzy, consuming like everything it could come across until it happened to come across the heroes here. And so the result is that they're basically fighting off against it as best they can. And that's really kind of just what's going on at the moment. They're just fighting off against it as best they can. And so again, things get wrapped up pretty quickly because, in order to kind of deal with this threat, what the Incredible Hulk does is use the Space Stone, run up on Devondra, create a black hole inside the entity, which literally just like sucks it into this singularity, and that's the end of Devondra. It gets wrapped up like that. And again, that's kind of a common theme in the story, is that things just kind of get wrapped up in like one page, and it's just kind of like, okay. And so then you turn around and you have Adam Warlock, who sits down and says, the main Marvel universe has basically been wiped out. All you have is the universe inside Soul World, and then like they've left the quarry of creation. So all that's left right now is the main Marvel universe folded onto itself in Soul World. And so Adam Warlock's idea is to basically restore everything back to normal. The quandary that Adam Warlock has, and what Jerry Dugan kind of toys with here, is what the aftermath will be. Will it simply be a reboot, which is what Marvel should have done out of Secret Wars, or is everything going to go back to normal? And the reality is that everything's going to go back to normal. Everything's going to kind of reset the way it was. The thing that you take away from this is that the Infinity Warps universe is basically copied, right? So I mean, imagine it's a piece of paper. A piece of paper has just been folded onto itself. Like that's what Gamora did. She took a piece of paper, which was the main Marvel universe, folded it onto itself, and then put it inside Soul World. And that's Infinity Warps. That's the universe that exists in Soul World. What Adam Warlock is going to do is he's going to copy that folded piece of paper, and then he's going to take it out of Soul World, then he's going to unfold it, and that's going to be the main Marvel universe going back to normal. And it kind of makes sense in terms of just fixing everything. The issue that they have here is that there's basically like they can't leave Infinity Warps inside the Soul World forever. Like they can't leave it there for all time. And so what they end up doing is creating basically like two universes, and then in turn just sort of dispersing everything among those two universes. And so it restores Infinity Warps and it restores the main Marvel universe. Now what this does going forward is it lays the groundwork for Marvel to start exploring Infinity Warps, which in reality, I mean, they kind of tease tease it a little bit with regards to the actual Infinity War story. I didn't read any of them because none of them interested me. But, you know, it does leave the door open for them to start exploring that or to do whatever they want with that universe, turn it into the Ultimate Universe or anything along those lines. They can essentially do whatever they want here. And so once everything goes back to normal, then Adam Warlock kind of has the second struggle, which is, can we go back and undo all this? Like, is it possible to change all this? And that's one of the things it kind of deals with here. One of the things to bear in mind, and this is one of the things that Jim Starlin discussed in Infinity, I can't remember which one it was, but it was the one where Thanos enters the mind of Adam Warlock and Adam Warlock enters the mind of Thanos to see how the other views all of creation, how they view themselves and how they view the universe and so on. And one of the things Jim Starlin established in that story is that Adam Warlock is a being of order and structure. If the universe were left to Adam Warlock, if he had total power and he could create the universe in his own image, it would be rigid and structured. There would be no real free thought. There would be no real freedom of choice or anything like that. There'd be no free will. And so Adam Warlock's kind of struggling with that internally in terms of, yes, I can make everything the way that I want it to be, or I can go back in time and stop this, but there's always consequences. Remember, branch universe theory. So if Adam Warlock goes back and he changes things, then what that means is there's a universe out there where he didn't change anything. And the question that has to be asked here is which one will become the main Marvel universe? And so it's just kind of a risk. It's a gamble for Adam Warlock. But at the end of the day, what he does is he makes the choice. He disperses Gamora, sends her out there, uses the Infinity Stones and says, like, I'm basically removing her and sending her to a place where she can quote unquote do the most good, whatever in the heck that happens to mean. And then in turn, what he does is he gives the Infinity Gems souls, right? Like, he goes right back to the point right after they get there and he gives Infinity Gems souls. And he basically says each of these Infinity Stones can now make their own decisions. They can go live their lives freely and kind of disperse. Now, Jerry Dugan's not pulling that out of thin air, right? Like, that's one of the things that was established in Brian Michael Bendis's Illuminati run. On some degree, they have some measure of sentience because they all want to be reunited. It's one of the ways that Bendis explained how it is people always end up acquiring all the Infinity Stones. That if you acquire one of them, it will lead you to all the others. And the more you gather, the easier it will be to locate the others. Adam Warlock kind of builds on that and says, now they're sentient beings. Now they can go out there, forge their own path and do their own thing. And what it does is, again, that sets the stage for Marvel to start focusing on people arbitrarily getting the Infinity Stones, introducing new characters, some character we've never seen or heard of before, who suddenly gains an Infinity Stone. You know, the other half of this is, again, Gamora has basically been whisked off to another location. We're not sure exactly where it is, on some far-flung distant planet, where she ends up uncovering this really kind of a tomb/casket made of rock, which houses the Magus, the evil future alternate personality of Adam Warlock. And this is what I want to kind of talk about for a second. When it comes to stories that we cover, by and large, I usually try not to throw my opinion in there in the extreme, right? Like, kind of, I throw it out to you guys, explain what's going on, give you guys some history on the characters who were there, how it all kind of ties together into the history of Marvel Comics, and then you guys come to your own conclusions. But in reality, I don't know what the point of this story was, except to, I guess, maybe make money. It just kind of didn't really seem to serve a purpose, because in a nutshell, here's what happens. Gamora gets the Infinity Stones because she believes that she could fix everything. She does this by taking the main Marvel universe, folding it in half, throwing it into Soul World. This introduces Infinity Warps, basically characters from Marvel Comics, superheroes from Marvel Comics, supervillains who have been merged into a singular being, which was kind of fun, I guess, if that was your thing. What's left of the heroes basically band together and they start fighting off against, you know, what's essentially the hunger of the Soul Stone given physical form in the form of Devondra. Gamora wants to go to the Quarry of Creation to recreate everything, only to find out she can't. The heroes are still fighting Devondra for a little while. They finally make their way out. Loki's there somehow doing something, but we never find out what it is because he never does it, and then he leaves and goes home. And then the story ends. And that's basically it, in a nutshell. It doesn't really seem to have served a purpose at all. And more often than not, here's one of the important things. I mean, if this is a story that's a stepping stone to something much bigger, then it wasn't really felt. Because in Marvel Comics, and really in comic books as a whole, DC Comics, Marvel Comics, the whole 9 yards, when stories are stepping stones to something bigger, then it's obvious when you feel it, right? Like, you go back and you look at Chris Claremont's X-Men, it was nothing but building blocks. That's all it was. 1 builds to 2, builds to 3, builds to 4. But you go to more modern stories, and you look at these events like Loki becoming Sorcerer Supreme, which happened 3 months ago in Doctor Strange, and the stories serve the purpose of building on top of things, of setting the stage for something else, and it's tangible and you can feel it when you're reading the story. For this, like, everything, like, this crazy event happened and now nobody remembers and it's all basically undone. And it's kind of like, okay, so like we're right back where we started. And so it's kind of like, what was the point of it all? So I don't know, maybe one of you guys got something out of it more than I did. I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't mean to be negative and overly criticize it. It's just, as a person who's been reading comics for over 20 years, I see stories like this and they never usually bode well. They never usually have longevity because they don't lead to anything. It doesn't actually go into anything. Instead, it's a story story 5 or 6 arcs down the line, you could basically just say, well, you could just ignore that and pretend it didn't exist. Like it's like Spider-Verse, right? Like technically speaking, you could pretend like Spider-Verse never happened because it happened between 2 issues of Superior Spider-Man, like issue 21 and 22. Like it's not like there's an aftermath to Spider-Verse, right? It's not like Spider-Verse happens and then it has a ripple effect throughout the rest of Superior Spider-Man, going into all new, all different, or I guess the return of Peter Parker, and then all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man. Spider-Verse is never referenced again. I don't know. I mean, you know, even now with Secret Empire, it's still referenced, you know. I mean, it was referenced in the Superior Octopus one-shot for, you know, for the Spider-Geddon tie-in. So again, I don't know. I mean, let me know what you guys think down in the comment section. I'm curious what your take is, because again, I don't normally do this, but I don't normally read stories that end this way. Like stories don't usually happen like this in Marvel Comics. So it's kind of crazy. And again, it doesn't really seem to have served a purpose at all. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.